During the Blitz, St Paul's Cathedral somehow survived intact. The dome became a symbol of British resistance to the German bombers. But it emerged that the cathedral's website, until just last week, described the Prime Minister, during the war, Winston Churchill, as an unashamed imperialist and white supremacist. Right, that's nice of them, isn't it? On Friday, the post was altered. It now describes the man many believe our greatest ever leader as a figure of controversy, especially when viewed from a modern perspective. I mean, what do you have to do for a country to not fall victim to the woke mob? Joining me now is author and historian of the British Empire, Dr. Zarir Masani, and actor, writer and filmmaker Femi Nylander. Both of you, thank you very much. Dr. Zarir, I'll start with you. Was Winston Churchill a white supremacist?
Winston Churchill was a product of his time. He was born in Victorian times when most people around the world were racist in one form or another. Most Indians were racist about people darker skinned down south. Africans were racist about color. The Chinese regarded the rest of the world as barbarians. So Churchill grew up certainly with a conviction that the English nation and the English as a race were the best and the most superior in the world. Now, that he didn't, on that basis, discriminate against anyone. He committed no racial atrocities. He did not support the eugenics movements of his time. And he was very proud of the fact that, India's population under the British expanded from 150,000 in 1750 to 425 million 157 million in 1750 to 425 million in 1947. And he used to compare this with the Americans having wiped out their native population. So he was very proud.
I'll come back to you. I will come back to you. I think the phrase "a man of his time" might be quite appropriate to kind of quite neatly summarise what you were saying there. Femi, I'll throw it over to you. Look, when it comes to white supremacy, I mean, he did defeat the Nazis, who are like the ultimate white supremacy, aren't they? So, is it fair to describe him as that and basically only that on St Paul's website?
Well, I don't think it's correct to say that he didn't discriminate based on his beliefs in British superiority. If you look at Churchill, he said the Indians are a ghastly people with a ghastly religion. He said that the famine, which he was involved in, he was actively, as the leader of the UK, exporting food from India whilst there was a famine in Bengal in order to feed British troops. He said that it was their own fault for breeding like rabbits. He boasted about shooting 3 savages in the Sudan in his youth. He said that Palestinians only eat camel dung. He was definitely an imperialist, and he was definitely a product of his time. And he gave amazing speeches which talked about democracy and freedom, etc. But he didn't believe that this freedom should expand to the darker-skinned peoples of the world. He resided over the empire. He believed in the empire, there's a reason that Barack Obama, for example, when he took office, removed the bust of Churchill from the White House, because Churchill's government was directly responsible for the torture of Barack Obama's grandfather when he was fighting against the British in the Kenyan Mau Mau resistance. The reality is that, yes, Churchill should be remembered as someone who assisted in defeating the Nazis, as did the Russians, who you've just been speaking about. Yeah. But he should also be remembered as someone who held very, very, very dubious views about race, which informed his policies. As Prime Minister.
And that's actually a really good point to lob it back over, actually, because, now hear me out on this, all right, is there an argument to say, and I'll throw this to you, Dr. Zarir, first, that if Churchill hadn't had those kind of ideas and policies at that specific moment in historical time, then we might not have won the war?
Absolutely, because he stood up to Nazi Germany at a time when Britain and its empire stood alone. The Russians were in alliance with the Germans. The French had surrendered. And Churchill had the determination and the conviction that the British might come through it. after Dunkirk when things looked pretty grim. So for a couple of years, Churchill, stood alone virtually against the Nazis. Now, I mean, the kind of things you've just heard about Churchill is a conflation of things he said at different times in different contexts, things he never said which are attributed to him, and your other guest is just sort of spewing the kind of poison that is being poured into our schools today.
Did he say that or not? In your view,
Sorry?
did he say those things that Femi has just said?
All of the quotes are available on an article from The Independent called "The Dark Side of Winston Churchill." Just Google it. The Dark Side of Winston Churchill.
I was asked the question. He said that Indians had a beastly religion in relation to being very angry with Gandhi for launching the Quit India movement at a time when the British were fighting with their backs to the wall. He also was full of praise for the bravery of the Indian army, Muslims and Hindus. So Churchill,
but you made a good point.
At different times.
Right, I'm going to cut in because you make a good point there. Now, Femi, now Gandhi was an interesting chap to say the least. Wrote essentially love letters about Mussolini, who I think it's fair to say genuinely was an actual white supremacist. And Gandhi, as has been widely reported, was rumoured to have enjoyed a relationship with some very, very young ladies, OK? Whereas when we see Gandhi's statue or anything relating to Gandhi, you don't tend to see, white oppressive sympathiser or indeed another word potentially beginning with P there, do you? You just see Gandhi, cultural hero. Why is it the same? Why is it not the same for Winston Churchill?
Well, no, that's not exactly true. There was actually a movement in a Ghanaian university which asked for removal of the statue of Gandhi because he believed that Africans were inferior. Yep, and because he believed so that of course. I'm just saying that's. But okay, over here, as I say, you've just said people are being miseducated in schools. All the quotes I've given today, you can find in an article in The Independent called "The Dark Side of Winston Churchill." But another quote he gave: Gandhi should be bound hands and foot and put before the gates of Delhi and trampled on by a giant elephant whilst the new viceroy, i.e. the new person that Britain has appointed to rule India, sits on its back. That shows his attitude to Gandhi. And yes, Gandhi was a person that was flawed. Just let me finish, please. Let me finish and you can respond. Let me finish and you can respond. Gandhi was a person who was flawed in his own right in many ways, and I'm not here to advocate for Gandhi. But the reason that Churchill disliked Gandhi is because Gandhi wanted India to be independent, and India was very valuable to the British Empire, which is, as you say, a large part of the reason we won the war. It's not just Churchill, it's the thousands of people from across the empire that were compelled to work for a country that was colonizing them. And that's what won the war. The Indians, people from across the empire.
You're hearing a lot of completely invented quotes. The last quote about Gandhi being trampled outside the gates of Delhi is completely fictional. Churchill never said it. No one ever said it about Gandhi. So you're really inventing stuff, which is why we're getting an institution like St. Paul's putting up the kind of nonsense they did. And they've had to take it down and correct it and say, well, to say Churchill is controversial, which maybe he is, if you're hearing what you're hearing. But I think this complete invention of quotes, he said X, Y, and Z. He never said half those things.
OK, now, Femi, when you look at someone like Nelson Mandela, undoubtedly a great figure from history, there can be no denying that. However, Mandela obviously was a part of the ANC. They weren't shy about setting off car bombs in public, and innocent people died as a result of that. So when you see someone like Nelson Mandela, the argument about why he is just exclusively celebrated tends to be because he was overcoming and fighting against oppression. Whereas with Churchill, they ignore that bit out. They just go, well, they conveniently forget that he was fighting against the Nazis and that the world was on an absolute knife edge, don't they? Why is it that it only appears to be white people who are getting cancelled or getting hounded in this way?
Well, you have the situation entirely in reverse. We don't ignore that. We constantly, all of our media, all of our stories at school, we learn how Churchill drove the UK and won the war against the Germans, and we never learn about the things in the Mau Mau, about the concentration camps in South Africa, about the Bengal famine, all of the dark sides of his legacy. And all these quotes, just Google the quotes, go back to YouTube, word for word, listen to what I say. Google them and you'll find the sources. So it's nonsense to say they're invented.
Femi, I get it, because I've read the quotes as well. I admit I haven't gone into a British library and looked them up myself exactly. I've probably read the same articles as you. But Femi, can you just answer me finally, why is it that the likes of Nelson Mandela, to a large part people like Gandhi as well, when you look at them, they are taught as exclusively positive people, whereas right now in this country, you have to describe Churchill as some kind of imperialist white supremacist? Well, why is that? Is that just because he's white? What is it?
No, again, they're not taught just as great people, for one. And Churchill, as I say, is seen as one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century across large swathes of the world. So it's nonsense to say that he's only seen as a white supremacist. Okay. The reason that there's a difference is ANC, they were actually fighting against the oppressors from a position.
So was it Hitler? He was fighting against Hitler.
No. Churchill, the UK and Germany were not. There was not like a huge power imbalance between them. These were two modern European powers at war, and yes, they were fighting against Hitler, and Hitler had a horrific Nazi ideology. But at the same time, the UK declared itself the leader of half of the world and owned an empire which spread across huge swathes.
Let's be honest. To be fair, Femi, every other country was trying to.
You can't preach about freedom whilst owning a slave, and you can't preach about democracy whilst running an empire. It doesn't make sense.
Both of you, I'm getting shouted at. I've got to move on. I obviously could talk about this all show, but thank you very, very much, both of you. Much appreciated. Let's do it again sometime soon.